Hi everyone. Now I want to talk about the mini story for Day of the Dead. Okay?
Okay. Here we
Okay.
go. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes.
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
In Guatemala. Guatemala.
Guatemala.
Guatemala.
I arrived in
Guatemala.
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
AJ.
Well, me, AJ.
AJ.
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
First.
Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No.
No, I didn't arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd.
First.
I arrived in Guatemala on November
1st.
1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
November 1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on November
1st.
1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
Yes.
No, I wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
AJ.
No, I was, AJ.
AJ.
I was curious about
this
holiday. What was I curious about?
It's a holiday.
The holiday, right? I was curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
Guatemala.
Which holiday was I curious about?
November 1st.
The Day of the Dead.
Day of the Dead.
I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
To the cemetery.
To the cemetery. I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
Easy. Cemetery.
Yeah, I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
AJ.
Me, right, AJ. I went to the cemetery. Where did I go?
Guatemala.
To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
November 1st.
November 1st,
The
the
Day
Day
of
of
the
the
Dead.
Dead. Right? I went to the cemetery
On the Day
on
of the
the
Dead.
Day of the Dead,
November 1st.
November 1st. Why did did I go to the cemetery?
To see what was happening.
Oh, to see what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
AJ.
Me, AJ, went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
In Guatemala.
In Guatemala. The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
A day holiday.
A holiday. The Day of the Dead is a holiday.
What happening?
When is the Day of the Dead?
November 1st.
November 1st. The Day of the Dead was and is
November
1st.
First. So
I went to the cemetery
on the day
of the dead to see what was happening.
What I found
was quite interesting. Was it boring?
No, not boring.
No, it wasn't boring. Was it interesting?
Yes, it was interesting.
Yes, it was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel about the cemetery?
I feel it was interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
It was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The cemetery?
The cemetery. The cemetery was interesting. When was the cemetery interesting?
On the Day of the Dead.
It was interesting on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
No.
Was the atmosphere very sad?
No.
No, the atmosphere was not sad. The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad?
No.
Or happy?
Happy. Yes. Thank you very much for listening to me.